The morning the letter arrived, Nora Fenn was the only person awake in Ashvale Hall. She had been awake since 4, as she always was, because the fires did not light themselves, and the ash did not clear itself, and the household of the Duke of Ashvale ran on the invisible labor of those who rose before the world required anything of them. She had carried the morning coal up from the cellar, had swept the grate in the front drawing-room, had relaid the hearth with kindling so fine it caught on the first strike of the flint. She had not eaten. She had not sat down. By the time the long case clock in the entrance hall struck 5, she had done more work than most members of the household would do all day, and not a soul had seen her do it. This was, of course, the point. A lady's maid who was noticed was a lady's maid who had interrupted something. A housemaid who was remarked upon had either broken something or allowed herself to be seen in a corridor she had no business occupying. Nora had learned this lesson from her first week in service, 7 years ago, when she had still been young enough to believe that doing good work well was something a person could take a small, quiet pride in. 7 years had not cured her of the work. They had only cured her of the pride. She was in the library when she found it. She had not gone there to look for anything beyond the cold fireplace and the scatter of newspapers the Duke had left the previous evening. He kept late hours. She had gathered from the state of the room each morning, a glass half drained, a branch of candles burned down to their stubs, a book opened flat and face down at the spine in a way that made her wince every time. He read as a man read who had no intention of lending the book to anyone else. She did not suppose he thought about books being lent at all. The letter was on the desk, which was not, in itself, unusual. The Duke received correspondence enough to keep 2 secretaries busy, and it was no part of Nora's work to touch anything on the writing surface. She would have let it alone entirely, except that it had slid from the leather-bound blotter in the night and fallen to the floor beside the chair. And the rule about the floor was that things on the floor were hers to address. She picked it up without reading it. Or rather, she began to set it back on the blotter without reading it, and then her eye caught the seal, and the seal was wrong. It was not the Duke's seal. It was a device she had seen before, pressed into wax at the bottom corner of a broadsheet she had once glimpsed in her father's house, years ago, in a different life, a life in which she had been a rector's daughter who read the newspapers her father left on the parlor table and who had known the difference between one seal and another. Her father had circled the device with his pen and written beside it, in his cramped scholarly hand, a single word: French. Nora stood with the letter in her hands for a long, cold moment. The fire she had just built was beginning to catch, and the light it threw was amber and soft, and it made the room look like a place where nothing bad could happen. She was not deceived by this. She had grown up in rooms lit by firelight, and she knew that firelight only made terrible things look warmer. She did not read the letter all the way through. She read the first 2 lines, and the last. And that was more than enough. She put it back on the blotter with the care of someone setting down something that might break, or that might break her. And she went on with her morning, as though she had found nothing at all. If you have ever kept a secret that was not yours to keep and not yours to reveal, stay with this story a while. Nora did not know yet what it would cost her. The Duke came down to breakfast at 9. Nora was not in the dining room when he arrived, having no reason to be, having already cleared the breakfast things twice over in her imagination during the 4 hours she had spent pretending to do her ordinary work. She was in the corridor outside when she heard his footsteps, and she turned to face the wall with her brushes, and waited, as maids learn to wait, for the sound of his passage. He stopped. She was aware of it with the back of her neck, which prickled in a way she found inexcusable. She was not a woman who allowed her neck to have opinions about footsteps. She had trained herself out of any such responses years ago, in the early months of her service, when she had been 23 years old and not yet certain that the wall between her world and the world of the men she served was as solid as it appeared. "You," he said. She turned, because one turned when addressed, and she looked at him, because one looked when spoken to, and she saw him in the full light of a gray July morning, and thought, as she always thought when she was forced to actually see him, rather than simply know about him as a presence in the house. He was younger than she remembered from the last time she had been forced to look. 34, perhaps. Not more. Dark hair threaded with nothing yet. A jaw that needed a razor's attention, eyes the color of deep water on a cloudy day. He was dressed as a man, dressed who had dressed himself, without a valet's assistance, and the cravat was not quite right, and she noticed this with the precision she noticed everything, and immediately set the noticing aside. "Your Grace," she said. "The library fire," he said. "You lit it this morning." "I did, Your Grace." "At what hour?" This was not a question anyone had asked her before. She kept her face level. "Before 5, Your Grace." He looked at her for a moment in that particular way he had, which she had noticed before without examining, because examining was a luxury she did not allow herself. It was the look of a man who was measuring something, or trying to, or had given up trying, and was simply noting the result. "I see," he said, and went into the dining room. Nora stood in the corridor for 3 more seconds than she should have, and then continued down the hall with her brushes, and did not think about the letter, and did not think about the seal, and thought about both things without stopping for the remainder of the day. His name was Edmund Ravensworth, the Duke of Ashvale, and she had known him by reputation, before she had known him by sight. The reputation was not, in the main, flattering. He had inherited the dukedom at 27, in circumstances she had gathered piece by piece from the conversation of other servants, which was the only intelligence available to people in her position. His father had died of a fever, contracted during a visit to the continent, to France specifically, which had been a difficult thing at that particular time. There had been a wife, young and beautiful, and dead of childbed fever inside their first year of marriage, along with the child. There had been a campaign in the early years to place him in Parliament, and he had refused it with a directness that had offended men he could not afford to offend, and he had offended them anyway, and apparently considered the offense a fair exchange for his time. He was not liked by the sort of people who decided who was liked. He was the housekeeper Mrs. Platt had once told Nora in the careful, neutral tones of a woman reporting facts about the weather, a man who kept his own counsel to a degree that others found incomprehensible. Nora had understood this immediately. A man who kept his own counsel was a man who did not trust anyone to keep it for him. She had recognized the posture, because she had worn it herself for 7 years, and the weight of it was something she knew in her joints. What she had not known, and could not have imagined, was that his counsel might concern something that could end him. The word the letter used was agent. The word it used after that was arrangement. The third word that mattered was the word she had read last, at the foot of the page, above a signature she did not recognize. Continued. Whatever had been arranged was ongoing. Whatever had been paid for was being paid for still. She did not know what to do with this knowledge. She knew what she was supposed to do with it, which was nothing. Because a servant who involved herself in the affairs of her employer's enemies was a servant who would be dismissed without character, and a woman of 25 without character references in the year 1814 had no particular future to look forward to. She knew that a letter of this kind, taken to the right authority, would destroy the man who employed her and everyone in his house. She knew that doing nothing made her, in some small way she could not precisely name, complicit. She did not know what kind of man the Duke actually was. This was the difficulty. She had served in houses for 7 years, and she had learned the art of reading a house the way her father had taught her to read a text, attending not only to what was said, but to what the structure of the saying revealed. She had read Ashvale Hall carefully since her arrival 3 months ago, and what she had read was not what she had expected. The children in the tenants' cottages wore good boots. She had noticed this when she walked out on her Sundays, which she did alone because she had not yet made a friend in this house and did not expect to. The boots were sturdy and recent, the kind a landlord provided when he thought about whether his tenants had boots, which was not the habit of landlords who were engaged in arrangements with foreign governments. The stable hands were paid a quarter before their wages fell due, when the weather turned cold. She knew this because she had heard the head groom tell Mrs. Platt about it in the kitchen, in the flat voice of a man who had served under men who did not do this and knew the difference. The Duke himself ate what was set before him without comment and read through mealtimes, and had never once, in 3 months, spoken unkindly to anyone she had observed him speak to. He was not a man who performed kindness. He did not notice when she was in the room. He simply moved through his house as a man who believed, without examining it, that the people around him were people. She had not encountered many men who believed this. She spent the first night after finding the letter lying awake in her narrow bed in the upper corridor, listening to the house settle around her, which it did in the way of old stone houses, with deep periodic groans that she had once found alarming and now found merely talkative. She went through the letter in her memory, word by word, as far as she had read it. She went through the evidence she had assembled about the Duke's character, item by item, in the methodical fashion her father had called a clear inventory of the facts before you. She arrived at the conclusion she had already suspected she would arrive at, and then she spent another hour testing that conclusion against everything she had not yet accounted for. What she had not accounted for was the possibility that he was guilty and had constructed his household as a kind of alibi. That the good boots and the early wages and the ordinary decency were deliberate theater, designed to produce exactly the impression it had produced in her. She lay in the dark and considered this seriously, the way her father had taught her to consider the argument against the position she already held, and she concluded, with some reluctance, that she did not believe it. A man could build a theater of kindness, perhaps. Yet a man who built that theater was a man who needed an audience, and the Duke did not seek one. He treated his people well in the plain, unperforming way of a man who expected no one to notice, which was precisely the quality she had been taught to look for in a person who was what they appeared to be. She went to sleep somewhere near 3 in the morning, and rose again at 4, and went about her work, and said nothing. The second day was harder. She was in the kitchen garden at midday, where she had been sent by Mrs. Platt on an errand to the still room, when she saw the Duke through the kitchen garden gate, standing in the far corner of the estate grounds with his steward, a weathered man called Briggs who had worked the Ashvale land for 40 years. They were looking at a wall that needed repointing, and the Duke was listening to Briggs speak with the focused attention he gave everything, and she watched him for a moment without meaning to. He turned, as though he felt the attention, and looked directly at the gate where she stood. She moved at once. She did not know whether he had seen her clearly enough to identify her, and she told herself it did not matter, and spent the remainder of the afternoon convinced it did. She stood at the window of the linen room in the early evening, looking out at the gray stone wall of the kitchen garden, and made the only decision available to her. She would return it to him herself. The Duke was in his study at 10 o'clock each evening, alone. She knew this from the pattern of the house. She had never had occasion to present herself at his study door before, and the thought of doing so now made something tighten beneath her ribs that she identified, with faint irritation, as fear. She was not afraid of him. She was afraid of what the conversation would require her to say, and more afraid of what it might require her to hear. He opened the door himself when she knocked, which she had not expected, and for a moment they simply stood on either side of the threshold while he took in the fact of her, a housemaid at his study door at 10 in the evening, with an expression he was apparently reading with some attention. "Miss Fenn," he said. She had not told him her name. She absorbed this information and put it somewhere she could think about it later. "Your Grace," she said, "I have something that belongs to you." She held out the letter. She watched his face change. It was not a dramatic change, for the Duke was not a man whose face changed dramatically, and she had been trained by 7 years of close observation to read the minor shifts, and what she read was not what she expected. There was recognition, yes. There was a stillness that preceded thinking, and then there was something she could only describe as relief, which made no sense at all, and which she therefore noted and did not yet explain. He took the letter from her hand without touching her fingers, which she noticed, and stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. This was not a sentence she had prepared for. "Your Grace," she said, "I should not—" "Miss Fenn." His voice was level, not raised. "Come in." She came in. The study was a room she had cleaned a dozen times and never occupied, which gave it the slightly foreign quality of a country seen on a map. He had lit the fire himself, she could see, burning with the particular awkward generosity of a man who had laid a fire without training. Too much wood, not enough air. She had an involuntary impulse to adjust it and suppressed this firmly. He set the letter on the desk and did not look at it. He looked at her. "You read it," he said. "The beginning and the end, Your Grace. And you are here. Yes. Rather than gone." She understood what he was not saying. A servant who found a letter with a French seal in a duke's library had precisely 3 options. She could destroy it and say nothing, take it to someone with the authority to act on it, or return it and say nothing. She had done none of these things. She had returned it and presented herself for a conversation. "I did not know what to do with it," she said. This was the truth, and she had decided, coming down the corridor, that the truth was the only currency she had to offer, and she would spend it plainly. "I did not know what it meant. I did not know who would be helped and who would be harmed by—" She stopped. "I did not know what kind of man you are, Your Grace." Something moved in his face. The water-dark eyes steadied on her in a way that made her aware of her heartbeat, which she found inconvenient and irrelevant, and was unable to stop. "And now?" he said. "I am still not certain," she said. "But I know that the tenants' children have good boots, and that you paid your grooms early when it turned cold, and that you have never once spoken cruelly to anyone in this house in 3 months. Which is more than I can say for the last 4 households I served in. And I know that I am a rector's daughter who can read a French seal, and that I have kept this knowledge for 2 days without acting on it, and that keeping it longer would be a different kind of choice." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he crossed to the fire and stood with his back to her, and she watched his shoulders settle, and he said, to the fire, "My father brought it back from France. The letter. Not this letter, but the correspondence. The arrangement. He made it before the war deepened, and he died before he understood what he had made. and I inherited it along with everything else." She did not speak. He was not finished. "I have spent 4 years attempting to close it without destroying everyone connected to it, including men who did not know they were connected to it. Men who served honestly and were used as conduits without their knowledge." He turned to face her. "I am not a traitor. I am a man who inherited a traitor's correspondence and has been trying to contain the damage quietly enough that it does not bring down anyone who does not deserve to fall." Nora stood in the center of the room and looked at him. She was 25 and had been a housemaid for 7 years, and a rector's daughter for 18 before that, and she had a rector's daughter's ear for when a man was speaking the truth and when he was constructing it. And this was the truth. She knew it in the particular settled way she knew things she could not prove. "There is someone at the War Office," she said slowly. "There is someone at the War Office who is already aware of the situation," he said. "A Colonel Hirschfield. I have been in correspondence with him for 14 months. The matter is near its end." He paused. "What I have not had is anyone in this house who knew." He said this last sentence as though it had a weight he had not expected, and she heard the weight in it, and did not pretend she had not. "I should go, Your Grace," she said. "Yes," he said. "You should." She went. She lay awake for some time afterward, which was not her habit, and she told herself this was because she had been holding a secret for 2 days, and releasing it was the physiological equivalent of setting down a heavy box, and the body took time to remember what standing without a weight felt like. She told herself this was entirely rational and had nothing to do with the color of his eyes or the particular way he had said her name, twice, as though he had known it for longer than a housemaid's name needed to be known. She was not entirely convinced by this account, but it was the account she had, and she went to sleep eventually with it. The following week was ordinary, except that it was not. He began to speak to her. This was, in itself, a violation of every rule of household management she had ever been taught, and she was aware that Mrs. Platt noticed, and that the other 2 housemaids noticed, and that the footman who had taken a mild interest in her before now looked at her with a different and cooler expression. She was also aware that she could not reasonably ask the Duke to stop noticing her, because she was not certain herself that she wanted him to. He asked her about her father. He asked what a rector's daughter had been reading, in the house where she had grown up, that allowed her to recognize a French seal. She told him about her father's library, which had been eccentric and various in the way of libraries assembled by a single mind over a long lifetime. Natural philosophy alongside sermons, alongside broadsheets, alongside the occasional French novel her father had acquired at a country sale and read, he always maintained, entirely in the spirit of scholarly inquiry. As she talked, she watched the Duke's face with the attention she had trained herself never to give anything, and she saw him listening the way some people listened, which was as though the person speaking was the only thing in the room worth attending to. She was not accustomed to being listened to like this. It was not comfortable. She would have said, if asked, that being listened to ought to be comfortable. But the truth was that 7 years of invisibility had made a person out of her whose default state was unattended, and being attended to now felt like standing too close to a fire she had not expected. Warm and slightly alarming, and not easy to step away from. She was honest enough to acknowledge this on the 4th day of that strange week. She was in the library, the same room with the same hearth and the same desk, dusting the shelves above the window when he came in without knocking. She stilled on the step stool without fully meaning to. He crossed to the desk, opened a drawer, removed a document, and then appeared to register that she was in the room. He looked up at her on the step stool. She looked down at him from it. This was not a position she had ever occupied relative to a duke before, and she was aware of its absurdity. "Miss Fenn," he said. Not unkindly. The way a man said a name he had been saying in some interior conversation and was now saying aloud. "Your Grace," she said. "I can return later." "No," he said. "Stay." He looked at the document in his hand and then set it back on the desk. "Are you a careful reader, apart from the French broadsheets?" She stepped down from the step-stool. "My father thought so," she said. He was not a man who gave the opinion lightly. He looked at her for a moment with the water-dark eyes. Then he said, "I have been trying to write a letter for 3 weeks that I cannot seem to write correctly. It concerns the affairs of a man I once trusted, and a sum of money I intend to return to persons who do not know it was taken. The difficulty is making it legible to people who know nothing of the background without providing a background I cannot yet make public." She held the duster against her side and waited. "I wondered," he said, with a careful neutrality that she recognized as effort, "whether a careful reader might tell me where it fails." She was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, "I am a housemaid, Your Grace." "I know that," he said. "I am pointing it out, because you appear to have forgotten it." "I have not forgotten it," he said. "I am choosing, for this particular purpose, to find it irrelevant." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she set the duster on the shelf. "Show me the letter," she said. She was not accustomed to being listened to. She was, it turned out, even less accustomed to having her suggestions adopted without argument, which the Duke did twice before she had finished reading the second paragraph. He had a pen in his hand, and he made the changes as she named them, in silence, with the focused efficiency of a man who had been waiting for someone to say the thing he had not been able to say himself. When she reached the end of the letter, she handed it back to him, and he read it through, and he said, "Yes." That was all he said. She retrieved her duster and went back to the shelves. When she descended from the step-stool 20 minutes later to move to the next section, she found that he had not left and was still at the desk, writing something new, and the quality of his focus had changed. It was looser now, less like a man pushing against a wall and more like a man building something. She left without speaking. The door swung shut behind her with a soft sound, and she stood in the corridor for 1 moment, and then went about her day. She was honest enough to acknowledge this too. It was not comfortable. She was honest enough to acknowledge this. He was in the garden one afternoon when she was carrying linens across the East Passage, and she did not expect to pass him. And he said her name without preamble. And she stopped. "I wish to ask you something," he said. "Your Grace." "You do not have to call me that when we are not in company," he said. She looked at him. "I am always in company with you, Your Grace," she said carefully. "You are a duke. I am a housemaid. There is never a time when that is not the fact of the matter." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I know." And then, less certainly, "What I am asking is whether the fact of the matter is the whole of the matter." She looked away from him, which was the only safe thing she could do. The garden around them was July green and overgrown in the way of gardens that belonged to a man living alone, and she thought, looking at a rose that needed cutting back, that she had been asked questions before that required her to say no, and that this question was not shaped like those questions, which made it harder to answer, and more important, to answer correctly. "I cannot tell you that," she said, "until I know how the letter ends." He understood her. She had learned in this past week that he was a man who understood the thing said beneath the thing said, which was both useful and dangerous in equal measure. "It ends soon," he said. "Hirschfield believes before the month is out." "Then I will answer you, before the month is out," she said, and picked up her linens and went inside. If you are still with her, then you know already what she did not quite allow herself to know yet. Some of us take longer than others to trust a door that appears to be open. Nora had been closing doors for 7 years, and her hands were quicker than her hope. The month did not quite pass before Colonel Hirschfield arrived. He came on a Wednesday, in a plain carriage with no livery, which the Duke had apparently arranged for reasons Nora understood without being told. For a military vehicle at the gates of Asheville would have started conversations in the county that no one wanted to have. She saw the colonel arrive from the upper passage window, a compact gray-haired man of 60 who moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent a long life not wasting motion, and she resumed her work and told herself that whatever the outcome was, she had already acted on the best information she had available, and that the rest was not hers to control. She believed this for approximately 4 hours. Then Mrs. Platt summoned her to the front drawing room, which Mrs. Platt had never done before, and she came through the door to find both the Duke and the Colonel standing by the window, and the Colonel looking at her with the assessing expression of a man who had been told something about her, and was deciding whether it matched the evidence. "Miss Fenn," the Duke said, "I have told Colonel Hirschfield that you are in possession of the relevant facts. He would like to hear from you directly." She sat down. The Colonel sat across from her, and the Duke remained standing at the window with his back to the light, which meant she could not easily read his face, which she suspected was intentional. She told the Colonel what she had found, what she had read, and in what order she had made her decisions. She was precise and brief, and did not embroider. She described the seal exactly as she remembered it. And she described the language she had read, the 2 words, and the 1 word at the close. And she did not say more than she had seen, or imply more than she had concluded. The Colonel listened with the absolute stillness of a man who had spent his professional life extracting information from reluctant sources and who recognized, she thought, a cooperative one when it was sitting in front of him. He asked her about her father's library. He asked about the specific broadsheet and where it had been acquired and what year. She answered each question with the same precision. And when he asked her, finally, why she had returned the letter to the Duke rather than taking it to the local magistrate, she said, "Because I had reason to believe the Duke was not a traitor, and none to believe the magistrate was not." The Colonel smiled at this, which transformed his face entirely. "You should have been in intelligence," he said. "I was in service," she said. "It is much the same work." The Duke, she noticed, was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, which was something in the neighborhood of pride, and which she noted and set aside for later examination. The Colonel remained for the afternoon, closeted with the Duke in the study, and Nora went about her work with the particular discipline of a person who had decided, once and for all, that what she could not act upon, she would not anticipate. She stripped and remade the beds in the east wing. She pressed 3 sets of table linens and returned them to the linen press. She swept the front steps with a thoroughness that caused Briggs to observe, from the kitchen garden gate, that the steps had probably not been that clean since 1800. She did not listen at doors. She had never listened at doors. It was the one rule she had always kept, even in households where the information available behind them would have been useful, and the temptation to listen was genuine. A servant who did not listen at doors retained something that a servant who did had exchanged away for a piece of knowledge, and the exchange, in her father's accounting, was never in favor of the listener. The Colonel left the following morning with the document the Duke signed at the writing table in the library, in the early light, while Nora was relaying the fire. She had not known he would be there. He had not known she would be there. They occupied the same room for 11 minutes without speaking, while she laid the kindling and he sat at the desk reading a paper she had no intention of looking at, and the fire she built caught cleanly on the first strike, which she had been aiming for every morning for 3 months, and which felt, that particular morning, like a minor personal vindication. He did not leave details about the colonel's business, which was expected. He left a sealed document for the Duke, which the Duke read alone, and which Nora learned the content of only indirectly. When Mrs. Platt told her 2 days later that the house seemed lighter, somehow, in a way she could not explain, and that His Grace had eaten a full breakfast for the first time in recent memory, Nora understood what had lightened. She had felt the same quality of lightening herself 7 years ago, when she had finished her first month in service, and understood that she was going to survive it. The drawing room on the evening of the 8th of July was lit with more candles than it usually held, because the Duke had invited 3 families from the county to dinner, which he did perhaps twice a year, and which the household treated as a minor military exercise. Nora was not responsible for the dinner itself, but she was responsible for the drawing room in the hour before, which meant she was still in it when the guests began to arrive, and she was in the process of carrying a branch of candles to the side table when Lady Meredith Foxcroft entered the room. Lady Foxcroft was the most decorated woman in the county in the sense that she wore more of her jewelry at once than anyone else did, and she had opinions about who belonged in drawing rooms and who did not. And she voiced these opinions with the particular confidence of a woman who had never once been made to reconsider them. She looked at Nora with the flat assessment of a woman cataloging something she expected to find uninteresting. "One of the maids," she said to the woman beside her, an impression rather than an identification, the way one said one of the chairs. Nora set down the candle branch and prepared to withdraw. "You are a housemaid," Lady Foxcroft added, directly to her this time, in the tone of a question expecting confirmation. "Nothing more." "Just so, my lady," Nora said. The Duke entered the room. He had heard this, or enough of it. She could see by the quality of his stillness when he crossed the threshold that he had heard the last sentence at minimum, and she watched him make the calculation that men of his kind made when they entered a room where something had just been said that required a response, and she watched him decide. He crossed directly to her. Not to Lady Foxcroft. Not to the assembled guests turning to acknowledge him. To Nora, who was standing by the candle branch with her hands folded and her face arranged in the expression she had spent 7 years perfecting, which conveyed nothing at all. "Miss Fenn," he said. He said it to the room, which was to say he said it so that the room could hear it and register that he intended them to. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was steady, which she was grateful for. "I would ask you to remain," he said, "if you are willing. I have an announcement to make, and you are part of it." Lady Foxcroft's fan stilled. The room stilled. Nora looked at him. She had told herself, in the garden, that she would answer him when the letter was resolved. And the letter was resolved. And he was looking at her now with the water-dark eyes that she had stopped pretending did not affect her, and waiting. Not pressing. Waiting. Which was the harder thing to do, and the more honest. "Miss Fenn," he said more quietly, "is to be my wife." The room made a sound that was not quite speech. Lady Foxcroft made a sound that was not quite silence. Nora said nothing at all for 3 full seconds. "This seems hasty, Your Grace," she said, and he looked at her, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite, but was almost, the expression she had decided she most wanted to see on his face. "It is exactly as hasty as it needs to be," he said, and not a moment more. There was a great deal of conversation after that, most of which she was not required to participate in. Lady Foxcroft said, in the carrying voice she used when she meant to be overheard, that this was highly irregular. And the woman beside her said that it seemed a shock. And the young man in the corner, who turned out to be the Honorable Mr. Cavendish, said nothing, but looked at his wine-glass with the expression of a man revising his understanding of how evenings could go. A third woman, a Mrs. Ellery whom Nora did not know, looked at her with an expression that was not unkind, the kind of look given by someone who was remembering something and adjusting their accounting of it. The Duke spoke to each of them in turn. He was patient and deliberate and absolutely unmoved, and Nora stood at the edge of the room and watched him be unmoved and thought that she had been right about the kind of man he was, which was not a common experience, and one she intended to take seriously. Lady Foxcroft left early. The remaining guests stayed through supper, and were, by the end of the evening, either genuinely reconciled to the situation or sufficiently skilled in the forms to give a plausible impression of it, which Nora gathered was the best outcome a dinner of this kind could produce. Mrs. Platt found her in the corridor afterward and held her hands without speaking for a long moment, which told Nora everything she needed to know about what the housekeeper had thought and not said for the past several weeks. "You will be very good at it," Mrs. Platt said finally. "At being a duchess. You will be terrifying." "I sincerely hope not," Nora said. "You will be exactly as terrifying as needed," Mrs. Platt said, "and not a moment more." And her eyes were bright, and Nora laughed for the first time in longer than she could easily remember. The kind of laugh that comes out of a person when they have been holding something cautiously for a very long time, and have finally been given permission to set it down. The announcement in the broadsheets produced correspondence from the county, London, and 2 addresses in Bath. Most of it was directed to the Duke. Some of it was directed to his solicitor, Mr. Avery, who had the equable temperament of a man who had handled the Ashvale affairs for 30 years and had encountered surprises before, though not, he admitted to the Duke, quite this particular variety. There was one letter directed specifically to Nora, from a woman in Hertfordshire who had employed her 3 postings ago, and who had always, she wrote, thought highly of Miss Fenn's good sense. The letter was brief and kind, and ended with a sentence that Nora read twice and then set down beside her father's book, because it was the kind of sentence that needed to sit beside something solid. The letter that mattered most for other reasons arrived from London at the end of the 2nd week, in a plain envelope with a seal Nora had not seen before, but the Duke recognized immediately. He brought it to her in the morning room, which was now her morning room in the practical sense of being the room she sat in after breakfast, though she had not yet quite found the shape of that. He stood at the door rather than entering, which she noted. "Hirschfield," he said. "Good news?" she asked. "The last of it," he said. "The correspondence, all of it, every agent and every conduit, has been closed. Anyone who touched it unknowingly has been cleared of implication. It is done." She looked at him standing in the doorway. The morning light was gray and kind, the way English light was in July, and it fell across the side of his face and made him look, she thought, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had only just set it down and was still working out how to stand upright without it. "Come in," she said. He came in. He sat across from her at the small table where she had been reading, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment, which was its own kind of conversation. The fire had been laid by one of the new maids that morning, and it was burning unevenly, and she had the same impulse she always had, and this time did not suppress it. She crossed to it, adjusted the upper log with the iron, and the flame straightened and steadied. She sat back down. 4 years, she said. 4 years and 3 months, he said, since I understood what my father had made. Alone, she said. He did not answer this immediately. Then he said, until 3 weeks ago. She had not cried in some years, having trained herself out of the habit on the grounds that it served very little purpose and always happened at inconvenient times. She did not cry now. She simply reached across the table and placed her hand over his, which was a liberty she had not permitted herself before, and which felt, when she did it, like the most natural motion in the world. His hand turned under hers and held it. I should tell you, he said after a moment, that I asked Platt about you, when you first came to the house, before any of this. I know, she said. She told me. She told you? She thought I should know, Nora said, that you had asked. He was quiet. And did it change anything? He said. She considered him across the small morning room table, this man who had carried a dead man's treason in silence for 4 years, and lit his own fires badly, and spoken to her, consistently, as though she were a person worth speaking to, and who had asked Platt about her before the letter, and the seal, and the study, and all the rest of it, which was a piece of evidence she had been collecting and had not yet named. It was one more piece of evidence, she said. I collect them, as you may have noticed. The corner of his mouth moved again, more fully this time. She decided she had been right, earlier, about wanting to see that expression. The wedding was in September, at the small church on the estate grounds, with no guests beyond those who had reason to be there. Mrs. Platt cried without apology. Mr. Avery confirmed the settlements with the satisfied expression of a solicitor who had arrived at a clean resolution. The Honorable Mr. Cavendish, who turned out to be a distant cousin who had received one of the more bewildered letters about the engagement, attended and shook the Duke's hand with the expression of a man who had decided, on reflection, that the world was larger than his previous understanding of it. Mrs. Ellery attended as well, because she had written a brief note to the Duke the week after the dinner, saying that she thought he had done correctly, and the Duke had shown the note to Nora without comment. And Nora had written back to Mrs. Ellery herself, and they had begun a correspondence that was still finding its shape. The morning of the 1st of October, Nora sat in the morning room that was now unambiguously hers and read a letter from her former employer in Hertfordshire, who had written a second time to say that the news had reached the county and that she was glad of it, and that Nora had always been worth more than the wages she had been paid, which was generous and also true. She set the letter on the table beside a small volume of her father's. She had kept through 7 years of service, and moving and starting again, a slim collection of essays on the relationship between observation and judgment, the spine worn soft from handling, the pages marked in his cramped hand. She had carried it into every house she had ever served in, wrapped in her spare apron at the bottom of her trunk, and it had sat on every mantelpiece in every small cold room she had occupied, and it sat here now, in the morning light, on a table that was hers. Edmund came in without knocking, which was his habit now, and set a cup of tea before her without ceremony, which was also his habit, and looked at the letter. "Good news?" he said. "An old kindness," she said. "Arriving late." He looked at her in the way he had, the direct, water-dark look that she had stopped finding alarming and now found simply reliable. "They often do," he said. She picked up her tea, and the October light came gray and mild through the window, and the fire was burning properly this morning, which it always did now. And outside the window the ash trees were turning gold along the drive, the whole long avenue of them, their leaves beginning that final brilliant clarity that comes just before the fall. She had spent 7 years making herself invisible in rooms that did not want to see her. She had been seen in a library at 5 in the morning by a candle she had lit herself. It seemed a reasonable way for a thing to begin.